Now that we know how organisms interact with each other, let's look at how those interactions actually encourage a change in their populations over the course of time. And to do this, we're actually going to start with cell phones. So think about cell phones you see today. Maybe you have one, maybe your family has a couple or one. Um, but it looks a lot different than the very first cell phones that were around. The very first cell phones were much more simple. They had to charge for a long time. They could make phone calls, and that was all. Over time, there were more needs, and people started to say, hey, let's have this characteristic or this characteristic. And over time, cell phones changed with the needs of the people that were using them. And today, we have a cell phone that can do much more and meets the needs of today's population. So let's look at how this works with organisms. So a long time ago, there was a scientist named Charles Darwin, and he sailed around the world. And on his journey, he noticed some changes or variations between animals depending on which island he was visiting. And when he was at those islands, he noticed some things about the environment. He noticed that the availability of food was different. He noticed that the characteristics of the plants, so shelter, living space, that those were all different. The coloration, the size, the amount. And as he noticed this, he also noticed some specific characteristics about the organisms that were living in those locations. One of the things that he noticed was with birds. He noticed the finches had a different shape beak depending on the food that was available to them. So some of the beaks were long and pointy so that they could reach down deeper into a flower to reach their food. Some of the beaks were more curved and short to be able to crack their food open and survive on that island with the food that was available. He also noticed that tortoises, another one he's famous for is tortoises, had a different length neck depending on the food that was available in on their islands. So he made these observations and he went home and he started to process this all. And he at home had pigeons. He actually raised pigeons, and this was a hobby of his. And as he was raising these pigeons, he was breeding them to get the traits that he wanted the best. So he would take one pigeon that had traits that he really, really liked, and he had another pigeon that had traits that he really, really liked. And he bred them in hopes of getting a quote unquote perfect pigeon. Today, we call this artificial selection because he was artificially choosing which traits he was hoping would be passed on. So the idea of artificial selection is choosing a trait and then breeding it with another organism that has a trait that is also desirable, and hoping to get an organism that has the traits that they like. We do this same process today with all sorts of different organisms. Cabbage and cauliflower and broccoli are three organisms that all stemmed from the same original plant. So depending on which characteristics were desired, people bred the plant together with other organisms that had traits that they wanted, and depending on which traits they were selecting, they ended up with different plants. One of the plants they ended up with was broccoli. Another plant they ended up with was cabbage, and another plant was cauliflower, simply by breeding together and choosing the traits that they wanted to have. Apples are a really obvious one. We see this in our grocery stores all the time. In fact, we see this with the University of Minnesota selected and selected and selected traits from apple trees that they really liked. And they said, oh, this apple has really good storage life, and this apple has a really sweet flavor, and this apple has a nice crisp texture. And they bred the two apples together that they liked the best in hopes of getting an apple that had maybe a long storage life and a sweet taste. And then they bred that apple together once they got it with another apple that maybe has that nice crisp texture. Eventually, after many, many, many tries, like 30,000, they might end up with an apple such as the Honeycrisp apple. And dogs are a really good example that we're all pretty familiar with. We breed dogs in order to try and get a dog that might be a good herder or a dog that is low on the allergy scale. Maybe we have a dog that's a really good hunter. Maybe we have dogs that are just really great companions. Maybe we have a dog that's a great seeing eye dog, so good helpers. But depending on which traits we want, we take two different breeds of dogs and we breed them together to get, quote unquote, the perfect dog. So that's as Darwin started thinking through this, looking at his pigeons, he started to realize that this was happening on a much slower scale in nature. And so as he was thinking this through, he's called this artificial selection that's happening in nature natural selection. And natural selection is the process where populations of organisms that have variations or differences that help them survive in their environment live longer, they compete better, they reproduce more than those that don't have the desired variation. And this happens through a process that involves reproduction, variation, competition, and selection. So let's look closer at those. So this is the big picture. Organisms or populations reproduce and they make many offspring that inherit the characteristics that the parents have. And some of those are different from others. Some of them might have a longer neck or a shorter neck. And through competition, the organisms that are able to get the most energy are the organisms that survive and then reproduce. And ultimately, those traits are the ones that are selected over time. So let's look at this a little more closely. First, our organisms need to reproduce, and oftentimes this happens at a rate where they're making more organisms than the ecosystem can support. We call this they overproduce. So they make a lot of organisms. And as that's happening, there is variety in their characteristics, and that happens through mutations. And we saw that this happens randomly. So some organisms end up with longer necks, some organisms might end up with shorter necks, depending on how the genes are distributed through the population. So as those genes then are distributed, this creates what's called fitness. So fitness is the ability to survive or reproduce when genes are passed on. And you have a high fitness when you have a high ability to survive. So those organisms that had the longer neck were better able to reach food and they had a high fitness. They had a high ability to survive. If you have a low fitness, then you have a low ability to survive. So in this case, the tortoises that didn't have the longer necks had less food available to them. They were less likely to survive, and therefore, if they're less likely to survive, they're less likely to pass their genes on. So that creates what's called selection. Over time, the variation or the variety of trait that gets inherited more is the one that ends up existing in that population. And when that happens, we call it an adaptation. It's an inherited trait that increases an organism's chance of surviving and reproducing. So if I have a trait that is favored, then I'm more likely to survive, and that is an adaptation. So here it is in a nutshell. Ultimately, we have all these birds and they're saying, yum, green beetles, I like green beetles. So they eat all the green beetles. Those are the easiest ones to see. They're the most delightful. And over time, over many generations, they're continuing to eat the green beetles. But this provides time for those lighter red colored beetles to reproduce. They're hidden, so they're more likely to survive. And many generations later, the green beetles may be entirely gone or mostly gone, and these reddish brown beetles are the ones that are able to flourish and survive in their population. It's bringing it back to cell phones. Cell phones we've artificially selected because we've chosen the traits that we like, and those have been the ones that have passed down over time based on the needs of the population. And in nature, this same thing happens at a much slower pace, but it does happen based on whichever traits or are more fit for the environment.